Welcome to Creative Tien channel. Today I'm going to knit a very simple fingerless glove on an LK150 knitting machine. This one is for my 11 years old daughter because she has to wait for bus very early every morning, so she needs some warm gloves to wear. And I did a little swatch, find out the tension I like, and based on that I draw my little diagram here. And this is a very simple one. Basically it's a rectangle, and I have mark ribbon in the bottom and on the top, and when we fold in half we can sew up the sides. I can knit another piece of mark ribbon and attach to the sides for the thumb hole, and that one is optional, but I think it's nice to have. Here's the yarn I'm using. I'm using sportswear yarn, so it's pretty thin. And for the tension, I'm trying to keep it 2.5 for the center area and 1.5 for the ribbon. So I'm starting with the mark ribbon. I need 42 stitches total because we do every other stitch for the mark ribbon. I have half of the stitches. I start with a simple E-wrap for these stitches, and the other stitches are in the back. And I can put on some weight and knit one row first. This is my 1.5 tension, the smaller tension for the ribbon, and I start to knit based on my chart. I have 24 rows because 12 times 2, because we have to fold in half for the mark ribbon. So it's 24 rows for this area, and I'm just going to knit. After I knit 24 rows, I can start hanging the stitches from the cast on row, the E-wrap cast on, and then hand it back to the empty needle. So we can push back the needles. That's every other needle we put away earlier. I want to have 42 stitches, so make sure I will have one extra here on the right, 21, and then 21 on the left. It's easier to take off the weight or the cast on comb, so it's not too tight. And I will pick up a stitch in the corner for the first empty needle. And then I will pick the big loop, that's the E-wrap cast on, for the second one. And then we just keep going. The big loop here, the next one. Now we hang all the stitches. I can just push out all the needles to the D position, so it's easier to knit the next row. And I change tension to the main tension. Mine is 2.5. And change the counter back to 0, 0, 0. Now we can start to knit the main part. And for me, it's 32 rows of plain knitting. And remember to hang the weight and knit 32 rows. Now I have 32 rows. We are going to do the mark ribbon again, and we need every other needles. And I saw a technique from Diana Sullivan's video for making mark ribbon without holes. Her method is to use a contrasting yarn and a large needle and take off every other needle. And this way you will prevent large holes in between the main piece and the mark ribbon. I like the idea, so I'm going to follow the method. And I'll start with the second one. Take it off the needle and place it on the yarn. and then every other one. And place the empty needle back to the non-working position. And we'll do the same all the way to the end. After placing every other needle on hold on a contrasting yarn, we can start to do the mark ribbing. So I will set the tension back to 1.5, and I will push the needle out. The counter back to 000, and I will need 16 rows. Because it's mark ribbing, I will fold it in half, so you'll be a row showing. So just need 16 rows. Now after 16 rows, I can pick up the stitch. We put it on hold on the contrasting yarn and back to the empty needle, just like before. We take every other needle to the working position again and start hanging all the stitches back to the needle. And then we'll need one row and then bind off. Place to the empty needle, the second one. Now we finish hanging the stitches. We can push all the needles out and put the knitting back. And we'll just need one row. I want to increase the tension a little bit. It's 1.5, I will have 2.5. And just need one row. Now we'll use sewing bind off to make a stretchy bind off. We will cut a long yarn tail and thread it through a needle. We go from the second stitch, from the back to the front. It's easier to push the needle out a little bit. Back to the front. And then front to the back to the first stitch. Tighten up a little bit. And then we will go 2 stitch forward and 1 stitch back. 2 stitch forward from the back to the front and 1 stitch back from front to the back. And then you can take off the first stitch. And we just keep repeating that. 2 stitch forward, so that will be the third stitch. And then 1 stitch back. That's the second stitch. Then take off the first stitch. Now that's after the bind off. You can see it creates a little ridge here. And this is the front side. We can start taking off this contrasting yarn. Now we just need to knit the thumb piece. The thumb piece is the same as the mark ribbing in the beginning. I have 20 stitches and every other needle will be 10 stitches. And we'll need 16 rows, so we can fold it in half to become 8 rows. Now I have every other needle set up, E-wrap, tension 1.5, and I'm going to need 16 rows. And I will pick up the cast on stitch and hand it back to the empty needles. And I will add one more stitch because I want there 20 stitches from 10 to 10. So I pick up a stitch in the corner, go to the first stitch. And I need one row. And bind off the same way with sewing bind off. Now we are done with the thumb piece. You check it's big enough to cover the thumb. The only thing left is to sew it up like that. This is the thumb piece. I will leave a few stitches here, and because of the mark ribbon, it has 2 layers. I will start with the inner layer. Maybe just use a whip stitch, or you can use matrix stitch to sew from the inside and then sew the outside, this and this together, and we go up. It's the same with the ribbon for the thumb. We can start with the inner part of the mark ribbon, sew up these 2 lines together, and then we sew the outside, and then we can sew the bottom part. And we can go from the top down to just sew the inside first and then go down. I try to use the yarn tail as much as I can. If it's not enough, I will cut new piece of the yarn to continue sewing. The thumb will be 90-degree angle, but I think it's an interesting design too. And after sewing, you just need to make another one exactly the same way, because there's no left or right side of gloves. Both of them are identical. Since my needle is already in this thumb piece, I will start here and whip stitch the inner side together first, and then we'll go to the outside. Just sew the inside here, and I'm going to sew the outside. So this edge and this edge. And just pick up 1 stitch from each side. The edge stitch is fine. Now that's the final mitten. We just have to make another one for a pair. That's for 11 years old kid size mitten. I hope you like this video, and see you next week.